Welcome to this Onward event. I'm Anthony Brown. I'm the MP for South Cambridgeshire, a member of the Treasury Select Committee, former Chief Executive of the British Bankers Association, which is probably why they asked me to do this, and as it happens, an advisory board member of Onward, a great think tank that's doing a lot of very constructive work in Parliament and outside Parliament, and indeed hosting events like this. The subject for today, as you know, is about financial services, with the title Competitive Advantage, how do we keep UK financial and professional services firing on all cylinders? It's a subject close to a lot of people's hearts, not least because financial services is, as I'm sure many of you know, our biggest export industry, employs between 1 and 2 million people, how you define it, and also the biggest taxpayer of any industry, paying for all the hospitals and schools that everyone likes. Clearly, post-Brexit, there's financial services regulation is now fully under control of the UK government. What do we do with it? How do we make sure that we keep our position as a global financial capital and indeed thrive as a global financial capital? And I'm delighted to have a fantastic panel here of experts who we look forward to them sharing their wisdom and insights. First of all, Ranald Geraldino, who used to work at Lloyds Bank, I discovered, for 7 or 8 years in the capital markets there, so certainly knows about financial services, and is now Trade Minister, promoting new trade deals around the world and seeing whether we can leverage financial services into that. Baroness Nikki Morgan, who used to be chair of the Treasury Select Committee, was the Financial Services Secretary to the Treasury, Economic Secretary of the Treasury, so Financial Secretary of the Treasury, Economic Secretary of the Treasury, and also well known as Education Secretary and DCMS Secretary, so she's been in the Cabinet a few times. And then we have David Postings, who's the Chief Executive of UK Finance, which is actually a follow-on body from the British Bankers Association, so in a sense is one of my successors, but a lifelong banker, actually really does understand banking. And then to my right, Gareth Davis, a fellow New Conservative MP in the 2019 intake, also a banker for a very long time, has just joined me on the Treasury Select Committee. Haven't had your first meeting yet, but about to. And he's been campaigning on quite a lot of financial services issues, including the green bonds, which has been this big campaign, and the government has just launched the first big green bond, and we're giving him credit for it. Nothing to do with Chancellor. And then to my at the end, I was going to say far left, but you're not far left, so far right. Catherine McGuinness, who is, I'm sure, known to everyone, is the chair of the Policy and Resources Committee of the City of London, and basically as a representative of the city and financial services there. So we're going to have an opening statement from everyone on the panel. We've only got 1 hour. I'm going to be very strict. We're going to finish at 3:15 exactly, literally 1 hour. So if you could keep your opening statements to you threatened to do one at 25 minutes. If you could keep it to 5 minutes, and really, how do we keep UK financial and professional services firing all cylinders? And then we'll open it up to discussion and questions. If you've got a question, then please raise your hand, and I will then ask you. If nobody asks any questions, then I'll start asking lots of questions, and it'll be awkward and difficult ones. So first up, speaking order, we have Ranald first, then Nikki, then Gareth, then Catherine, and then David. So Ranald, over to you. How are we going to do this?
Thank you, Anthony. Great to be here. Thanks to you all for joining us today. I will be very brief because then we can get into the questions, and I'm sure there'll be plenty from the floor, so you don't ask me any tricky ones, Anthony. So that's great. But look, we have done trade agreements now with 68 countries around the world, plus the EU. That covers trade worth £744 billion last year, and there's more to come. And there's more to come, not only in terms of the markets that we want to do trade deals with, including Australia, where we need to get to the agreement, New Zealand, where we need to reach AIP soon, the US, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with whom we could have a phenomenally successful arrangement, which we don't have to pay for the privilege of joining, and indeed is a market with 500 million people. And GDP, combined GDP of £8.4 trillion, so a significant market in the Pacific. But there's even more beyond those, and this is where there is real hope, I think, for the United Kingdom and for jobs across the country. We've got plans to do trade agreements with India. We want to take our trade relationship with the Gulf further forward, and Latin America, Mercosur, I think, also is rich in promise. And global trade is predicted to grow significantly over the next 30 years. It's going to be doubling and quadrupling in dollar terms to reach $100 trillion by 2050. And we want an even bigger share of that. Now, we all know in this room that it is not just trading goods, though they are important. We're selling apples to India, we're selling JCBs to India, but we want to sell more services to India. And I think we also know that the UK is, they say it's the second largest services exporter in the world, but by our size, we are the greatest services exporter in the world. And I think we can really encourage more jobs around the country as part of that. And in fact, there are a few statistics I want to share with you to show that this is already happening. 90% of the capital raised in the United Kingdom comes from overseas. 2/3 of that goes into businesses outside of London. So when people say that financial services only benefits London and the South East, it's just not true. We can do much more for the whole country by making sure that financial services, professional services as a whole, are enabled. And 63% of professional business services roles are outside of London and the South East. So we are enabling growth in every corner of the country as part of our agenda. So what do we want to do? We want to make sure that Britain is the best place to invest in the world. We're already the best place to invest in Europe. We secured something like £20 billion of investment last year, and we're going to beat that, I'm confident, this year. We want to make sure that we are the best country from which we can export, so that we create the incentives for international investors to invest here, made in Britain, sold to the world. And we're seeing great examples of that across our country. Nissan, for example, significant investment from overseas to make sure that we're selling cars to Australia. But I come back to the point on services, which is why we're here today. We are a great exporter of services. We have some of the best skilled people in the world. We have a phenomenal ecosystem in the City of London, and we need to make sure that everything that this government does makes sure that that ecosystem survives and thrives, and that's what DIT is certainly up for. And trade means business, trade means jobs, and we're going to get on with it.
Great. Thank you very much, and you kept within your time.
I tried.
Well done. Brilliant. Right, next to Nicky Morgan. When you were at the Treasury responsible for financial services too, that was in the wake of the financial crisis, and it was all about mending financial services, which now hopefully will be a bit more positive. What do you think needs to be done to make sure that we come from all cylinders in financial services?
Well, actually, thank you very much, and thank you to Onward for inviting me to join this esteemed panel. It's a great pleasure to follow around. Andy, in your introduction, you obviously tarred David as being a lifelong banker. I should confess to this room that I am a lawyer originally, so it's not always a bad thing. But the reason I mention that is because obviously the title of this session is not just about financial services, it's about professional services too. And as Randall rightly said, I think in the UK we have the most fantastic ecosystem of financial services and professional services firms that work together. And that's why I'm absolutely confident that London's and the UK's markets are going to do incredibly well in the global marketplace that we see. But there are undoubtedly some challenges, and it's great actually to hear Randall speaking, because to hear that financial services has in a way come in from the cold, because Anthony, you mentioned the financial crisis, and I think it would be fair to say that financial services, perhaps particularly our banks, were not always the most popular entities in this country in the wake of the financial crisis. But it was completely right for the government of the day to lend financial support, because our banks are absolutely vital, both in terms obviously of yes, employment, the taxes that they pay, but also the jobs that they create because of the businesses and individuals that they support. And Randall was also obviously completely right. Minister, you are obviously always completely right. That's
what they tell me.
A backbench member of the House of Lords, that's always a safe thing for me to say, it is that obviously in terms of levelling up, again, our financial services and professional services industries, I'm thinking, for example, of financial services and things like the insurance sector, actually there are more jobs, as you said, outside the City of London. I know we've got Catherine here, and we want the city to succeed, but we also want our financial services and professional services sector to contribute to the very important levelling up agenda that we have. And we're going to be hearing lots about levelling up. I mean, for me, I think as some of the 2019 intake MPs have said, it's about making sure that people don't have to leave necessarily where they've grown up in order to have great jobs. And financial services and professional services firms are a key part of that in terms of driving the local economy. Now, as a former chair of the Treasury Select Committee, what do we need to do in order to make sure that our financial services industry really succeeds? Well, firstly, I think we have got to have a bit of debate in this country about the balance between competitiveness and looking after consumers. And consumer protection, because on the one hand we absolutely want, in the recent FCA consultation paper about investment firms, there is a lot of money that people feel quite nervous about investing, so they leave it in a bank account or even under the mattress, giving people confidence in the investment advice that they're going to receive, for example, and how that is going to therefore grow the economy. But when we talk about competitiveness, people immediately assume that's got to be a race to the bottom on standards. And I think it would be fair to say the regulators are very clear that that is absolutely not what any of us want to see. But this debate about competitiveness doesn't have to be about standards, it needs to be about sectors. And Anthony, as you identified, there are some sectors that we have done very well in the past, but also we're going to do, I think, well in the future. So green finance, fintechs, are just two examples. How Parliament is going to scrutinise future financial services legislation and regulation, which I know is a matter that the TSC is considering, is a matter of huge interest to people in financial services, quite rightly so. Because I think people often talk about the regulatory burden without necessarily being able to specify exactly what they mean. But things like, for example, the clearance process put in place by the regulators for people taking on senior functions in financial services institutions. Of course that's necessary, but it can also put good people off and people go and work in other sectors and we lose them. And that's the kind of thing we need to tackle. Having multiple regulators going in to review business models, again, is another, it has to be done in many ways, but is it being done in the right way at the moment? And as I say, that role of Parliament in terms of having onshoring of financial services legislation, I think the Treasury did a remarkable job in making that process happen. It was complicated legislation. But now I think the role of the Commons and the Lords is going to be supporting how we perhaps look at those regulations, how they're made in the future, how they're scrutinised in a way that means that the regulators and regulatory system can remain nimble for the challenges of the 21st century. So all of those things, and we haven't even got onto tax yet, are things that are going to mean that actually we do have a very competitive financial services and professional services industry. And we have some remarkable things going for us. My final point. As a former lawyer, English law is still something that people want to access, they want to use, they want to access our courts. How do we make sure that we're taking advantage of that? Our language, our time zone, the culture, people want to live in the United Kingdom. How do we make sure that businesses are able to get the talent that they need? All of those are issues. I absolutely know they're on the radar of ministers and government, and it's a question of making sure that when those of us perhaps now on the outside are putting asks to government, we are really clear about what it is that we want. So that we're able to work together to make sure that these industries flourish. But thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to your Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Turning now to Gareth Davis. What do you think needs to be done to keep financial services pumping all things?
Right, well, if this room is anything to go by, it is certainly firing on all cylinders. As Anthony, you quite rightly said, I've come to politics in 2019 after a long and happy career in asset management, working for a global asset management company in the City of London and in the United States. And so many conferences I stood in a room at the back, just like this, looking upon a panel like this, and I can't quite believe that I'm on the panel, so thank you for having me onward. As has already been said, the financial services industry in the UK is one of our greatest powerhouses for our economy. We're the largest trader of US dollars, more so than in the US itself, where the largest net exporter of financial services. Last year, financial services was one of only 2 services sectors to actually increase its exports. So we are already, as has been said, building from a very strong base. But first of all, we should remember that this is about people. Financial services is a people business. And to be successful in the future, to be competitive in the future, we need the best people to stay here and to come here into this country to bolster our financial services sector. Nikki quite rightly mentioned fintech. 42% of the fintech industry already in Britain today is staffed by people that don't come from this country. I want to see that increase, and I'm so pleased that Ron Khalifa in his review of the fintech sector had in it a provision for a visa to bring in the best and the brightest from overseas, and the Chancellor's going to act on that. I'm delighted to see. The second part, in addition to having the right people, is of course about trade. And it's a great honour to be on with Ranil, who's doing a great job around the world. And he's totally right that so many of these trade agreements are fantastic that we're securing, but they are largely about goods. And it is important that we turn our attention to services, because frankly that is where our revenue is coming from. That's where our growth in the future is going to come from. So he's totally right to say that. One of the difficulties though with financial services trade is that it's about regulator to regulator relations. And so I'd like to see this government, and all of us actually, have a greater engagement with regulators at the SEC and across the world to see how we can achieve, dare I say the word, equivalence of some of our regulations, so that we can expand our trade overseas. And I would focus on where I think we can win, and that is America and New York in particular. And I'd like to see greater efforts on that. And where we can win in that regard is around ESG. We are a world leader. Don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise. A world leader in ESG. I used to lead an ESG business in the City of London. We had $32 billion of assets, 16 analysts, and I've gone around the world and seen how poor so many other countries are at investing with purpose. We have a great opportunity, if we grasp it, to expand that dynamic. And then finally, we need the right fiscal environment for our financial services companies, and that might mean politically having difficult conversations with the British public. The first thing that we should have that difficult conversation about is the bank surcharge. We're currently charging our British banks 8% more than corporation tax. And if we want to compete with New York, no trade agreement in the world will make us more competitive if we continue to have that disadvantage for our banks. It was put in for good reason, but with corporation tax now going up, it is right that we review that to either cut it or scrap it altogether.
Thank you very much. And then moving on to Catherine McGuinness. So moving more onto the industry side of things, really. What do you think needs to be done?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to Onward and UK Finance. Really pleased to be doing this with you. I think actually we have a lot to build on, but we do need to build. I think this is a really critical moment, and I am going to echo some of the comments that others have made. It's been good to see the way that the sector has had a, if you can say this, a good pandemic. It's shown its resilience in the way it kept open. It's shown its flexibility in the way it shifted to remote working, and it's shown its innovation in the way it used technology to keep going. And could I also just say it worked really well, I think, with government in getting out support to businesses, and I pay tribute to UK Finance for the work that they did in spearheading some of the work there. We have a very strong basis on which to build, and our own research shows, when we look at other financial centres, that actually we have all the ingredients in spades, and we're still regarded as one of the best ecosystems around. But the competition is coming up fast. I would actually just take issue on whether we are still a leader in ESG. I believe we are a leader in ESG. I believe we are a leader, and we have the potential to be the leader. But if we want to do that, we really need to keep absolutely on top of this. And I think the same is true of tech. You know, we see too many bright ideas developed here, but they go off elsewhere to build, because for a variety of reasons, whether it's lack of access to capital or whatever. So I think that we really need to be looking at what our strengths are. We need to remember that our leading place on the world stage is built on strong foundations, but is not a given, and this is completely a time to reinforce. And I want to flag 3 particular points. First of all, around how we might enable innovation to thrive. Secondly, around openness to international trade. But thirdly, and perhaps I'll start on the third, the access to talent and skills, because you're absolutely right, this is a people business, and it's a people business that depends on getting the brightest and best, and developing the brightest and best from around the world, from the UK, and we absolutely need to look at pathways through the right skills so that people can enter the sector across the UK. but we also need to make sure that we remain open in the right way to overseas talent to serve a global sector that we are lucky to house. So we were pleased to work on a report with EY and City UK, which has just been published with a number of recommendations, building on some earlier work that we did. I commend that report to you, and I will encourage my team to tweet it out later on my Twitter feed, whatever. So people, but then an ecosystem enabling innovation to thrive. I would commend the recommendations in the Khalifa review. Again, there's something in there around visas, but there's a lot more besides, and we would very much like to see. We're very pleased to see the way the Chancellor has so far adopted and praised the recommendations, but we would very much like to see that. We'd particularly like to see the creation of a Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology, CFIT, because we think this would really help us to generate new opportunities to secure investment and jobs across the country. Because innovation and tech and fintech, but tech in many other forms, whether it's raw tech or red tech or whatever else, is something where we have great clusters of expertise around the country which we should really build on as we move forward. Openness to international trade. Two things I'd say there. I think first of all, remaining open to people coming and working here, firms working here, the openness of our regulatory system is really key. We're looking forward to seeing the future regulatory framework as it unfolds, but we have put in some recommendations there for how we can maintain and build on that openness. In your trade agreements and your trade negotiations, do please continue to put services front and centre of your thinking, even if that doesn't mean crystallising that into specific detailed provisions in those agreements. But let's look at what we can put in there, whether it's around digital flows, whether it's around digital, whether it's around data flows, whether it's around setting the framework for other methods of working together, regulatory discussion and collaboration. Of course, trade agreements are only part of the story, and let's look at what we can do to find parallel tracks. And I completely agree that the US, for example, is a major partner with whom we should be working. That's why I'm pleased to work with a coalition of trade associations this side and the other side of the Atlantic, which feeds into the Treasury-to-Treasury dialogue, looking at what we might do to enhance trade. And I think the moral of that story, apart from the potential of the US, is you have a sector here which is really key to work with government on moving things forward, on improving access, on ensuring that we do make the most of what we've got. And do please keep that sector close to you. It's great to see the new interest, the renewed support that we're getting for the sector from government. I believe that if we work with the sector, we really can use it to help level up across the country and develop not only jobs and growth in the sector itself, it's a great enabler for everybody else's business.
Great, Catherine, thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to time as well. I hope you're all preparing your questions. I hope after our last speaker there'll be a forest of hands shooting up, otherwise I'll start asking questions. And we are on to our final speaker, David Posting, the Chief Executive of UK Finance, the voice of finance. What does the industry want?
Thank you, and thanks for coming, and thank you to Onward for hosting this. You referred to me as having been in banking a long time. Actually, looking at the ball there, I joined when Blondie were playing this venue, so you can see it is quite a long time ago. There's been references to financial services and levelling up. I'm pleased to say I ran 2 financial services businesses that aren't in London, as well as many that are. And I think I'm incredibly optimistic about the future for financial services, but I have some challenges to put to government and to regulators as well. So let me just talk about a few of those. So on talent, I think it's really vital that we do attract talent from overseas. However, I think the FCA and the banks work on, and our firms work on, inclusion and diversity are really important, particularly social mobility. I think if we're going to really grab hold of the levelling up agenda and apply it to financial services, that's an area where we can make a real difference. When it comes to regulation, people have talked about flexibility. I was really pleased with the interaction between our members, UK Finance, and the Treasury early part of this year, running through the whole year actually, looking at the details post-Brexit of financial regulation, and the amount of listening that went on was really brilliant. And so I want to commend them for that. I think it's really important that we do embed as much as possible into the rules rather than into legislation, which will give us flexibility, but it does then imply a big burden on Parliament to scrutinise those regulators. And what we don't want is a regulator of regulators. So that balance is quite important, I think. I think we here sometimes are a bit shy of talking about the power and the heft we have outside this country. And so I think we can play a big role in setting standards. And rather than sort of myopically worrying about the guys on the other side of the channel all the time, we should lift our sights and think about the world in general and our place in it. And I think we can help set the standards so that regulation is proportionate, fair, flexible, and yet protects the people it needs to protect. We've talked about taxation. I think we shouldn't be shy of talking about taxation. I think the banks have paid their penance over the last decade or more. The reason for the levy has disappeared largely. The Chancellor has hinted on a couple of occasions, as has the EST, about the surcharge. And we produce a report every year with PwC, which I know the Treasury's been actively considering and using as a source document when thinking about taxation. It's very clear when you compare us to New York and to Frankfurt that we are out of line. And in fact, if you look at Dublin and Amsterdam, which I actually view as two of our major competitors in the EU, rather than Paris and Frankfurt, we are quite considerably out of line. And the recent announcement for NI just makes things a little more difficult. So I'm confident they will address that it needs to be addressed if we're going to be truly competitive. On the ESG agenda, I think it's undoubted that we have to make a rapid move to net zero, but we must do it in a way that takes the most vulnerable in our society with us. So whether they're small businesses or individual consumers, it's very tempting when you operate in a London bubble to think about, multi-million-pound properties and large businesses and get carried away. Actually, there's a huge swathe of people who are going to struggle to fund the transformation to net zero, and we need to have a just transition. So I think there's a real onus on financial services, and particularly the regulators, to think about not using a sledgehammer of capital ratios to try and drive portfolio changes without thinking of the consequences. And finally, I suppose I'd like to just point out one or two of the things that concern me from a government perspective. I think what the Chancellor has set out in terms of his vision for the city is very positive. I was at lunch today and the Prime Minister was talking in a similar vein, which is great news. However, the government isn't entirely joined up. And there are parts of the government and the regulatory system which are considering things which actually make us less competitive. We might touch on that in the Q&A, or at least in my view they do, or could do, if they're not handled right. One of them is the duty of care, which the FCA are talking about. I think it makes it a less exciting place for people to do business. Now, we could have a debate about that in Q&A, I'm sure that will picture, I hope it's picture interest, willing to expand on that. And the other one I would draw out is the Bayes review into corporate governance. That concerns me too. I think it could stifle entrepreneurialism and it could make it a less attractive place to do business. I say those as words of caution rather than criticism because both those things are capable of change. And I think overall incredibly positive, and I think we can make this, take the opportunity that Brexit's given us and the opportunity that the pandemic has given us actually to really bounce back and to help support the government's agenda for levelling.
Great, David. Thank you very much for those challenges laid down to government and the rest of us. I can confirm the Treasury Select Committee, we are looking at how Parliament should scrutinise the financial services regulation going forward, the role played by the European Parliament largely before. not doing that role now. So we're up to open questions, and there is indeed a forest of hands. Okay, I think the guy in the watch show, you're actually the first to put your hand up. And then the guy in the front row.
Thank you. Tony Langham from Lansons. No one mentioned the British family, the Crown dependencies, the overseas territories. So the great investment centres of Cayman and Jersey and insurance in Bermuda. And what role do you think they have in success overseas going forward?
Great. Who wants to
Yeah, I'll be very brief on that. We have ongoing conversations with our friends in the Crown dependencies and overseas territories. Clearly, we want to make sure that they can grow their economies. That's a good thing for everyone. Again, it is part of an ecosystem, but we've got to make sure that the high regard that the British public have for transparency is driven forward, and it's important that we continue to see further progress in that area.
Next question.
Thank you very much. I want to start echoing what Baroness Morgan said, that people love the law in this country. They love to come and invest here. However, my question is to the Minister. You know, with every year there's a new tax. Recently, you've taken away some free taxes for the people who come and shop in the UK. So you're making it less attractive for people to come, actually. I know you recently signed a deal with UAE, which is great, but what about the Emirati investors, the individual investors? Are they going to come with what's going on? You're making it less attractive to them, I think. What do you think?
Well, I disagree with you. I think we are a very attractive place to come and invest. I think we're seeing not only a great deal, the questioner referred to the deal we've done with Mubadala, which is the sovereign wealth fund of Abu Dhabi, to invest £10 billion into the British economy. That is just the tip of the iceberg. I think we can do much more with our friends in the Emirates and beyond from that part of the world.
Could you, in the audience? I don't know where that noise is coming from, but it's very interesting.
So if we could just speak loudly.
Listening to somebody else's fringe.
Yes, exactly.
We might answer their questions.
Anyway, so I think we are doing some great work already. I agree with you. We must never be complacent. We must always look to make Britain a more competitive place to do business. I think we will see not only sovereign wealth funds, but more independent individual investors choosing Britain, because they can see that Britain is going to be at the heart of a new global trading network. And so this makes Britain ever better place for them to put their hard cash, knowing that they will get a great return on that investment, and they will be able to benefit from our rule of law, that they will be able to benefit from the fact that they can easily repatriate their capital from here as and when they wish, and knowing that we have some of the most highly skilled people, to Gareth's point, highly skilled people in the world here to be able to do great things with that investment. I think we're doing great things. But I will happily say that we must also be unashamedly the party of lower taxation wherever we possibly can do that. And so that is how we make our market more competitive. That is how we will make sure that we stand apart in the world. And I'm delighted that we are lower taxed than France or Germany or Italy. But we've, of course, got to go further in the context that we must make sure that we stand up for sound money too. And we can't allow, though this pandemic has made us commit £400 million, which has largely been funded by borrowing to help tackle this pandemic. We can't repay that overnight, but we must make sure that we do have a plan to do that. So we mustn't promise tax cuts that we know we actually have a heart can't deliver.
It's slightly distracting. I think someone was trying to sort this out. Maybe if we can just. I don't know if we can. Somebody from Onward here.
Yeah, they are.
We can just turn the whole AV system off and just speak loud. Does anybody else want to make any points on those? We're all listening out for the other Fringe. Okay. Simon Bennett first, and then the guy back.
Thank you. I wonder whether you're all being a little bit too optimistic here. I mean, there are a couple of challenges, big challenges. Fintech's an opportunity, but it also means a lot of reskilling. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. as a result of the transformation that is coming in from technology. We've also got the COVID effect. COVID has introduced a lot of innovation, but of course it's also meant we no longer think of clustering as quite such an effect as we previously did. So coupled with those things, and of course the third thing I would add is the regulatory burden, of course, has meant that the advice gap is huge in the market. So does the panel think that how many jobs do you think there will be in 3 years' time in financial professional services compared to today? And why do they think that?
Well, let me start with that. I mean, I don't ever subscribe to the idea that because you have innovation, that means that we're going to have fewer jobs or jobs are going to disappear. I think we had that with the first industrial revolution. Actually, what we saw was, of course, that different sectors grow and more people are recruited. You're right, there may well be a change in skills, but I think, actually, to be fair, the government and many businesses are already investing in reskilling a lot of their employees. But I think, if anything, there'll be certainly the same number, if not more, because I do think that these are absolutely growth sectors. There will undoubtedly, though, be a change. In any transition, there is a difficult period whereby people will need support and the opportunity to reskill and the confidence and recognising. But actually, for example, those financial institutions that are moving to delivery of services perhaps more like digital, we'll still find that actually there's a demand either for face-to-face or there's demand for people to be there. It might well be, and I think actually what the COVID effect is going to be undoubtedly where people work from, the flexibility that people will demand in future. People are not going to go back to the office full time. And I think the businesses have got a choice, and I would say government as well. You either accept that we are now living in a hybrid world and work out how we're going to make that work for employees. And David was completely right to mention the diversity issue, which I think actually none of the rest of us did, so thank you for mentioning it, because actually I think that working from home flexibility is a really good thing for diversity on all levels. But businesses have to invest to make that work for their employees. Just simple things like having a hybrid meeting, how you do that, how you involve everybody in the room, how you recognise that in terms of promotions, for example. So I think there's going to be more demand for jobs, but there will be different jobs, you're absolutely right, in the new post-pandemic hybrid digital world.
David?
Yeah, I agree actually. When I joined, everybody worked in branches and they don't anymore. So there are different jobs. That transition has been happening for decades. It is accelerating probably, but I agree, Nikki. I think the population of people working in financial services will be broadly the same. Probably more highly skilled, highly paid jobs in the future. But I don't think you should run away with the idea that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people still doing really, really mundane jobs. A lot of those have been automated already. The big banks sometimes get vilified for not moving fast enough and mercy of fintechs, but I think that is wrong. They have been investing in technology for decades, and I think it's a really vibrant thing, and welcome the challenge of fintech.
So in the early 1970s,
Come back.
we're doing so well.
We've got the silence there.
Right, speak very loudly.
Yes, just in time for me. If I start talking about PCR tests, obviously. And look, I'm really glad you've raised a note of caution, because I wanted also to sound a note of caution. I think we have a lot to build on, but this is a really challenging moment. It's a challenging moment because we're finding our new place in the world. There's a lot of competition around for areas like tech and for issues like ESG, because the world has to tackle
I just wanted to turn the title.
I think there will be lots of jobs in the sector, lots of jobs in the sector, but I want them to be here. Now, whether here in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, or whatever, I want them to be here, despite the opportunities that remote working has given, and it has given lots of opportunity, and let's build on that as part of the overall package. I'm going to be a bit London-centric for the moment, because I know most about what's happening in London on COVID recovery, but let's not underestimate the challenge that COVID is posing. When we spoke to people, as we did consistently through the crisis, to see if they were happy, when we spoke to the big stakeholders in London, the firms that placed their office centres with us in the city, in Canary Wharf or elsewhere, they all expressed an ongoing commitment to central office space. using it differently, but people have used office space differently over just the time I've been in work. It's not quite as long as the time David's been in work, but not far behind. You know, the pattern, the way in which you use your office has changed, and people are telling us they'll still want to get there for collaboration, for culture, for coaching, for all sorts of different reasons, which I could go on with. But they tell us that it's not just the office itself, it's the vibrancy of the area in which they're based. It's the ecosystem, it's the fact that you can meet other people from the ecosystem you're part of, and we have that in quantity, but it's the sheer vibrancy of the area. And I have to say, at the moment, it's getting a lot better since the start of September, that central London has not had that vibrancy. You go out in the streets and you can always see weeds tumbling down these streets in the city. There is a story around that because we did find a cannabis farm in the city, but that's I'll save for another time. So we, with the rest of other parts of with the other authorities responsible for central London, are really, really focused on getting people back in, on making sure that we do have a great offer for them when they come, that there are things for them to do besides being at their desk. But let's not underestimate the challenge of that. I'm very confident that we will rebuild for the future, that we will change in the way that people have told us they want us to develop. But it is a challenge, and we add that to the international competitiveness piece. And I think we really do need to be getting on the front foot and, as I say, fighting for the real advantages that we have. I'm very confident that we tend to do well when we're facing adversity, but we've really got to get on with it.
Yeah, I think we take it. Okay. Right, the question's been very patient with his hand up about the white shirt. White shirt, yeah.
No, we can.
We're only one Fringe now.
Yeah. What are we doing in this day and age to compete with the growing financial power of Amsterdam and Bermuda? Is Her Majesty's government tearing back the red tape as we were promised in the 2019 election? And fintech has become a bit of a buzzword, but can you explain a little more of, why it's such a game changer for the financial sector?
So, are we having a bonfire of the red tape and financial sector?
Well, look, absolutely, we want to make sure we've got the right regulation, and we are scaling back red tape wherever we can. One example of that is on digital trade. And with our trade deal with Japan, as an example, we have been able to go further and faster than the EU. We have enabled greater liberalisation of the flow of data, which is critical to enabling not only fintech and services businesses that are maybe growing and significant businesses in their own right, but also for small SMEs, because the SMEs can't afford a second server in Japan. They can't afford to set up shops speculatively waiting for a contract. They need to be able to have that transferability of data, and I hope that demonstrates that we're getting on with the job, delivering what we promised.
Yeah, I'll just thank you for asking about fintech, because it is genuinely exciting, and not just because of the contribution that the sector is going to make to our economy and for our workforce. It's actually something that, again, is not often talked about, and that's the democratization of financial services. It's the fact that we still, in this country, one of the most developed countries in the world, have so many people who yet still don't have a bank account, who don't invest and save for a pension, let alone for everyday items in the way that they should or could, quite frankly. And one of the things that fintech will bring is an ability for young people and old people to be able to see what they have invested in their pension fund. The dashboard, which was introduced by the pension scheme bill not so long ago, will group together pension funds that you've accumulated over your lifetime and be able to see it there on a screen somewhere. And I want you and I to be able to pull up on my phone and your phone exactly what's in our bank account, and to be able to invest that money so that it grows ahead of inflation and things like that. So I'm really excited. I hide it well, but I'm really excited about fintech because it will democratize financial services, which for so long has been just the sector for people who already know what it's all about. This is going to be really important for things like levelling up and the other agenda of climate change, which is dominating this conference, because you're going to be able to see where your money is being invested, and that's a game changer.
And before coming to Nikki and Catherine, that's just one point. The government is actually, Treasury have actually got a whole series of reviews of different sectors of financial services. I think there's 8 out at the moment. But they've just had consultations on looking at what rules can be changed and what rules can be got rid of. You clearly don't want to just go change the rules, but actually clearly thinking about it and consulting with the industry. Nikki.
Just on to the second part of your question, is with my former education and former culture acting hat on, because I think sometimes with fintech or any kind of tech, there's too much emphasis on the tech and not enough on the fin or the gov or the whatever else that we're talking about. Because we make it sound too complicated. People think this is sort of something that they could never get involved with. But actually, where a lot of fintech or any tech businesses are, is that somebody very bright has come along, not necessarily bright, they've identified a problem and they've thought, how can we do this better to make it easier for other people? And then, of course, they thought about, well, what technology would I need to do? And if we make it sound something that's unattainable, then people will think, well, actually, all this talk about fintech might be interesting in Whitehall, it might be interesting in the City of London, but it's not for me. And so actually, the other thing we've got to do is looking at our education system, is digital skills got to be taught right the way throughout the curriculum, right from the start. That means obviously, I mean, all of us have been through a tech revolution in our skills in the last 18 months. You know, the use of Teams and Zoom and all sorts of conference platforms and, you know, everything else means that we have all reskilled. And the same has happened in our classrooms, both with our teachers and our pupils. But speaking as a mum of a 13-year-old who's completely au fait with computers and tech and all the rest of it, getting all these digital skills embedded, looking at how we digitise much of our curriculum in the way that both people are taught, that people consume, people actually are examined, for example, through digital means, actually means that we're just talking about, going back to the gentleman's question here in a way, we're just talking about sectors we've already involved in, but delivering them and coming up with new services just in a different way.
Yeah, and I think we get too hung up on talking about fintech, but it really is tech across the piece that we're talking about. So, for example, I'm another lawyer. You've got the lawyer on the left and the right here. The catalyst that I've seen, the catalyst, it's been such a catalyst for our sector as well over the last couple of years. And we see great advances on looking at smart contracts, looking at what we can do with trading documents, so we move away from paper to something which is less easy to have fraud on. So it's really the application, it's the application of people whose business is going to help facilitate. I think there is a huge opportunity here. I actually wanted to come in on the deregulatory agenda, and I wanted to suggest that we should be re-regulating rather than deregulating, but with regulation that's appropriate for us, now that we are a single state and not having to carry 27 others with us. Being well regulated is part of what makes the sector attractive, why people want to base themselves here. But there is an awful lot we can do, and that's why these consultation processes are so important. It's really critical that we develop our own future regulatory framework, but we do need to get on with that.
So I'll be brief on fintech. I don't see the distinction anymore between fintech and everybody else. I think what's been a great catalyst is to look at the value chain and try and work out where you can make money in different slices of it, and that's been really important. The technology is almost a sideshow in a way. It's an enabler. The real clever thinking has been about how you can understand risk and how you can think about how you can make money from transactions and services. And I think that's becoming mainstream now, which is a good thing. In terms of regulation, and you mentioned Amsterdam in particular, I can't comment on Bermuda, but Amsterdam can only move at the pace of the EU, which moves at the pace of the slowest member, to be fair. And that's where we've got an advantage. We have time zone advantage, we have a legal advantage, but we have the advantage of now being able to set our own rules. It doesn't mean we diverge massively, but it does mean on those critical areas. So for MiFID, for example, we can be really flexible and sensible on the real detail of that. It gives an advantage to the investment banks over operating out of continental Europe, and we are going to do that.
And it took us 49 minutes to get to MiFID. Right, more questions. I think the guy in the white shirt there, you had your hand up before, and then the guy there, and then the guy back. Should we take 3 questions? We've got 7 minutes left. So we'll take 3.
Yeah, I'm following on from the regulatory question now, which to to what extent does the panel worry that fintech is packaging up old problems in new clothes? And in particular, I'm really concerned about the buy now, pay later platforms that seem to be growing like a mushroom at the moment.
Okay. Another blue tie here.
Yeah, so just to understand about this concern about the duty of care from the FCA, in a sense, as kind of SME, sort of I liken it to, improving our brakes so that actually the financial services sector can actually move further forward, even for retail clients, giving them enough choice for different kinds of products, even derivatives. And I guess part of that question is also, maybe the FCA is taking this kind of action because things like the BBRS and everyone knows from his days as sort of BBA before as well, there are still unfortunately a few legacy issues affecting the banks, and even Baroness Morgan will know from her time at the Treasury Select Committee, which these SMEs are still unhappy about, and that is unfortunately eroding a bit of trust in the financial services sector. So perhaps if you sort of try and tackle some of those, then actually that may help you to push back on the FCA and say actually there is no legacy issues anymore.
And the third question.
I think I've been a banker for 20 years. I'm not lifelong, so I'm getting there near the I've seen in my financial services career, we're talking about raising taxes, and one of the biggest financial services taxpayers says, I'm going to go to Hong Kong. When you're talking about, differentials in rates and charges, which you mentioned earlier, and again, we've been talking about it for 12, 15 years, and it's never happened. And we're still talking. Take it as a constructive, I'm not being a critic. Do you think these are achievable, reforms? If I can call it a reform, the big reform I saw was Brexit, which was taking the whole country and was successful. I love it. And I'm looking at these reforms as well, so that financial services can grow, and you can bring in more financial services into UK. And I've earned all my livelihood from that, and it's a good money. I think it's a great opportunity for the British nation.
Will we actually achieve any of the reforms? Good question. Right. So I'm going to I'll start at that end of the panel and go this way. So you take your pick of the questions, but the FCA, the duty of care, I think, particularly the industry you raise it, but also fintech is packaging up old problems, and will we do any reforms?
Okay, so on the duty of care, if you ask the man in the street, should a bank have a duty of care towards him? Yes, so yes. So I don't think anybody argues with that phrase. What I'm concerned about is the implementation that's outlined in the first consultation. I'm conscious there will be a second consultation. The first consultation gives private right of action, and my worry there is we'll end up with another PPI if we're not careful. It will have potentially hindsight involved as well, and that concerns me. And what concerns me as a consequence of that is that inevitably banks will take a risk decision about who they deal with, because they'll have to have a duty to look at your entire relationship and your entire, not just relationship with them, but financial picture, which will be very difficult to analyse, and so it could result in financial exclusion. So it'll have the exact opposite effect, and we've seen that happen already with advice. Firms used to offer advice, most don't, and so I think the unintended consequences of this are pretty significant. That's just a little snapshot of a few, but I am concerned about that, and I think we will end up with a duty of care. I just hope that we can get one which is balanced and sensible and doesn't have those unintended consequences. Turning to fintech, and you particularly mentioned buy now, pay later. I don't think we should demonise buy now, pay later. It's a form of finance that works for many, many people. I think there will be some tweaks needed, particularly with regard to credit reference agencies. I think that's an inevitability. The Woolard Review did look at that, and so I would imagine there'll be some changes down the road. But I don't think fintech's packaging of old problems for the future.
Nikki, pick a question there.
Well, I think in a way you can bring all the questions together, because I think our second questioner, that trio, actually mentioned the most important word, which is trust. And the reason that the FCA has, I think, proposed this consumer duty that they are thinking about bringing in, I'm sure there will be some reforms. I don't think it's a question of if, I think it's a question of how. And the reason that we're concerned about buy now, pay later, or the reason that PPI, or the reason that we think the Online Harms Bill must cover fraud and scams and everything else, because unfortunately there are still some actors where the regulators and government and the Treasury Select Committee and members of Parliament and people who receive complaints hear far too many examples where actually the institution let down the customers that they were there to serve. And my question on all this is, can you ultimately regulate for a trustworthy industry? Or do you have to do something far more fundamental in terms of the way you allow people to have licenses, to hold senior management functions, for example, to demonstrate their integrity? And I don't think buy now, pay later is a bad thing in itself, because actually, as I understand it, a lot of the younger generation, many of whom appear to be here at Party Conference, making me feel very, very old, actually don't use credit cards anymore. And so I think what we're seeing is a market development. The issue is going to be, how do you make sure that those people offering buy now, pay later actually do it in a responsible way, with upfront, clear interest rate information? What happens when people miss a payment? There's always going to be different segments of the market for whom they will need different financial products, but it needs to be done, and that's what I think the regulators. So we already have treating customers fairly, and actually the point about will we actually reform, we can reform to our heart's content if we wanted to. I actually think we're done. We don't need a big bang approach. We don't need a 1997. You're right, Brexit has happened. I think our financial services now needs to be more of an evolution than a revolution. But as in so many other walks of life, the issues around character, trust, integrity, behaving properly towards those who are paying you fees is actually where the debate needs to be.
Thank you. Ralph.
Thanks, Anthony. I won't repeat the excellent points that have been made. I'll say two very quick points for the interest of time. First, we need to unleash Britain's agility. I think it's absolutely right that there are reforms that people have long talked about. There are reforms that we could indeed get on with right now, and I think that effort, that work that will be required, really should focus on not only things that just be easy, but actually the ones that will deliver the best benefit for Britain's agility. And I think Catherine was talking about that earlier as well. So I'll say enough there. And on trust and buy now, pay later, and so on, I think there's a consumer side piece of work that's required around better financial education and so on. And yes, government has a role. Yes, government should create the right regulatory framework. It shouldn't be too overbearing on business, but equally it does need to leave opportunities for consumers. And consumers and businesses have their own role to play. And so we need to arm them with the ability to do that. So, for school children to get some basic money management, through to older people being advised better on the scams that need to be avoided from folks who have found loopholes in the system because we have regulation that they then exploit. We need to arm people so that they can act in their own best interest far better. I don't think we as a party should say that government can fix every problem. Actually, we should try and help businesses and people solve their own problems too.
Excellent, thank you. 2 minutes left. Gareth and Catherine. Gareth first.
Shall I just very quickly, I won't add to the very good explanations that's already been given, except to address your point about will this happen, will reform happen. The only thing I would say is that if anything's going to happen in terms of support for financial services, it's under this government, this party, and this Chancellor. This Chancellor walks and talks financial services. It's made very clear that, by the way, it comes from financial services, which also helps, right? But he's made very clear that the message should go out across the world that if you are a financial services company, this is a home for you, and we'll make it a comfortable place for you to operate with very good people to employ. And I would just, last thing before I pass on for the final time, we have a city minister in John Glenn who is the longest serving since 1947 when this role was created. He was widely respected when I was in the other job, and I respect him even more now I've seen him work up close. He's a detailed man, he's passionate about the city and financial services. So under this government, this Chancellor, this Treasury team, I have every confidence that we'll see it.
Okay.
Yes, and indeed John's contribution is hugely respected by the sector, so that's great. and also for Charleston's vision for the sector, as you set out in the management speech. 3 very, very quick points from me on the reform agenda. I agree with Vicky on evolution, not revolution. In part, that's because the system we're working with at the moment it was designed by us anyway, against the backdrop of international standards, and we'll carry on wanting to comply with good, coherent, and shaping good, coherent international standards too, besides our own standards. And thirdly, I was just going to reiterate that point that the sector has a place to play, I would suggest, in helping to develop as we go forward. It's the consultation with speaking to the sector has been very good throughout. Let's make sure that we carry on as we implement the new framework as it emerges. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It is 3:15. It's 1 hour's time to come to close. I want to thank our panelists of the other Fringe who joined us, as well as Catherine Gareth Davis, Rebel Geraldina, Nicky Morgan, and David Foster. Thank you all very much.